Hey there, it's Dr. Peebler again. We're back to talk about mitochondrial function and, in this case, mitochondrial heteroplasmy. And we left off the last time talking about atherosclerosis and hardening of the arteries and how mitochondrial dynamics and mitochondrial function relate to this. However, this time we're going to talk about heart failure. And heart failure is another complex topic within cardiology. And so we're going to start off by talking about just in general what the healthy heart, requires. So obviously the heart is pumping all the time, 24/7, 365. So it's going to demand a lot of energy. And in this case, it's going to be demanding a lot of ATP. And as a matter of fact, as we'll learn a little bit later, the heart demands and puts off about 6 to 30 kilograms of ATP per day, which ends up being about 13 to 65 pounds of ATP made in the mitochondria of the heart itself per day, which is astonishing. So obviously there's going to be some ATP demand, and it's going to be met by an ATP supply. And that demand supply ratio is going to be changing all the time, depending on whether or not you're at rest or whether you're running or whatever you're doing. The heart is going to demand more so they can keep blood flowing to the place it's supposed to go and oxygen in the cells where it needs it. And then you're going to have to make up for that by providing some kind of a supply in order to have a balanced demand supply ratio. However, in a failing heart, you're going to have a decreased ATP supply. When you have mitochondrial dysfunction, they can't make as much ATP, and therefore the supply is going to be decreased. And then in that case, even a normal, demand by the heart is going to be an imbalance. So when people who have heart failure, they have a very low tolerance for exercise or a very low tolerance for activity because they can't keep up with the demand, that increased demand. And sometimes when they're really bad, when we're looking at like an end stage situation here, where you have basically complete energy depletion of the heart and you have basically contractile failure where you can't even hardly, be in bed or be doing just general activities, that would a normal person be able to do, get up, stand up, go to the bathroom, go to the kitchen to make yourself some food. Like that even is too much of a chore for the heart at that point. And that's when you're at a really high risk for mortality and death. But going back to the failing heart, so basically you have a decreased ATP supply, and that's represented in this graphical representation by a decrease in fatty acid oxidation, or just oxidative phosphorylation, which is the main way your mitochondria make ATP, and an increased reliance on glycolysis, which is sugar burning, which is not an efficient process. And in that model, you have metabolic remodeling, mitochondrial stress, and then you have cardiac remodeling, which leads to contractile dysfunction, and ultimately, like we talked about on the right side of the graph, complete contractile failure, where the heart has actually failed. Okay, so with that knowledge kind of in place, we're going to look at how, and this paper is titled Mitochondrial Dysfunction and Heart Disease, Critical Appraisal of an Overlooked Association. So, and this, I didn't highlight it, but this is where it talks about how the mitochondria, or the myocardium, or the heart itself, is among the most energy consuming tissues in the body, burning between 6 and 30 kilograms of ATP per day within the mitochondria. So although mitochondrial genetic disorders account for only a small portion of cardiomyopathies or heart related illnesses, mitochondrial dysfunction is commonly involved in a broad spectrum of heart diseases, and it has been implicated in the development of heart failure via maladaptive circuits producing and perpetuating mitochondrial stress and energy starvation. So that's basically what we've been talking about. The mitochondrial dysfunction leads to an energy bioenergetic decline, which then leads to perpetuating mitochondrial stress and energy starvation. So on the right-hand side, you're going to see that there's a mitochondria. They zoom in. There's a colony of mitochondria, which make up all these tissues, right? The energy production of all these tissues. And inside of the mitochondria, we know that there's mitochondrial DNA. Those mitochondrial DNA code for specific mitochondrial proteins. And those proteins and their function and structure all determine the mitochondrial function or the performance of that mitochondria. And when you have disruptions in the mitochondrial DNA, aka increasing mitochondrial heteroplasmy. You'll have decreased, protein production and/or protein, dysfunction, which leads to decrease in the performance, which leads to a decrease in ATP production, and which ends up being this very kind of like vicious cycle of decreased ATP, more reactive oxygen species, or oxidative stress, which then leads to damage, further damage of the cell itself, the mitochondria, proteins, as well as the mitochondrial DNA, which we've talked about in the past. And this picture is talking about how the cardiomyocytes themselves, the actual muscle cells that contract within the heart, there's the fibroblasts, which make collagen, smooth muscle cells, which are, inside of the blood vessels that contract and dilate the blood vessels. And then you have your actual skin of the blood vessels, the endothelial cells. And when each of those subtypes of cells are inefficient or inability to produce sufficient energy or are in that perpetual damaging cycle of reactive oxygen species or oxidative stress, then it leads to a kind of a cascade of problems, which lead to ultimately heart failure. And that's exactly what this figure says. It says mitochondria and multiple cells and organ types contribute to the pathogenesis of heart failure or the creation of heart failure or its risk factors. So this next slide is basically saying very similar things. It's going to say that, okay, as a byproduct of ATP production, we know that there's going to be reactive oxygen species. That's just part of this is part of it. And we're going to talk about ROS, reactive oxygen species, or all types of oxidative stress in later videos. But basically what we know is those ROS, excess ROS, will damage proteins, fats, or lipids, and the mitochondrial DNA. And the ROS mutated mitochondrial DNA coexisting with the wild type or the normal mitochondrial DNA is what we call mitochondrial DNA heteroplasmy. We've talked about that at length. However, the progressive increase in mitochondrial heteroplasmy causes progressive mitochondrial dysfunction, leading to a loss of their bioenergetic capacity, disruption of the balance of mitochondrial fission and fusion events, mitochondrial dynamics, which we'll talk about in the whole next part of our series, and decreased mitophagy. The failure of mitochondrial physiology leads to an accumulation of depolarized and reactive oxygen species generating mitochondria. Thus, besides the attenuation or the decrease in ATP production, dysfunctional mitochondria interfere with the proper cellular metabolism and signaling pathways in cardiac cells, contributing to the development of age-associated cardiovascular diseases. And in this case, we're talking about heart failure. So this is another depiction of how mitochondrial dysfunction is intimately involved in the pathophysiology or the abnormal physiology of heart failure. And it's basically saying that oxidative metabolism, or oxidative phosphorylation, the creation of ATP through the most efficient pathway in mitochondria, is the main source of energy in the heart. And the inability to generate and transfer energy has long been considered the primary mechanism linking mitochondrial dysfunction and contractile failure or heart failure. However, the role of mitochondria in heart failure is now increasingly recognized to be beyond that of a failed power plant. And that is where this next slide, to the right, starts to really unpack all the different mechanisms that are related to heart failure in particular. This is a very busy slide, but interestingly enough, by the time we are done with all of our lecture series, you are going to understand every single bit of this slide. Okay, so where we're going to focus out on the very center part. We're going to see where it says oxphos efficiency. So we can see that on the right, you're having decreasing oxidative phosphorylation efficiency. And on the right, you're also going to see that there is an increasing mitochondrial DNA heteroplasmy and a decreased copy number, or the amount of actual copies, physical copies of the DNA. So that way you have a vicious cycle that becomes part of the central role of heart failure. Is you have increasing heteroplasmy, you have damaged mitochondrial function, you have decreased oxidative efficiency, which leads to excess reactive oxygen species, which damage mitochondrial DNA, which then lead to increasing heteroplasmy and ultimately heart failure. And all these other factors, for example, the sirtuin, SIRT1, PGC1 alpha, the pink-parkin mitophagy pathways are all going to be covered, as well as these antioxidant response genes, the PGC1 alpha or the NRF2 genes. These are all going to be covered in future talks that we have. And by the end, like I said, by the end of this series, this mitochondrial series, you're going to understand every single bit of this and how it relates to mitochondrial function, how it helps you understand how to protect your mitochondria and ultimately your whole body, and help you prevent a lot of these diseases that people are plagued with throughout the Western and throughout the world. So I hope that really starts to tie in how something as simple as ATP production and redox and balance starts to become a central role, or play a central role within a lot of the conditions that a lot of us are familiar with, whether we're in healthcare or not. I mean, I don't think anybody doesn't know anybody who hasn't had congestive heart failure or a heart attack or a stroke. And these are, as a matter of fact, as we talked about, in our first lecture about the sun and disease, when we went through all the main causes of death in the United States. I mean, heart disease is the #1 killer, second only to cancer and neurodegeneration. So this is a big deal, and we see this every day in the hospital and the clinics. We see this in our family members, and this is how the process is created, and this is how the process, hopefully, when we have the right information, can be arrested and prevented. So if you like these kind of videos, please like and share and subscribe. Please leave comments about questions or just things that come to your mind, and I will try to address those, whether or not they're in these kind of format or whether it be in our nurse and doc roundtables, which we're having weekly as well. Until next time.